The last type of derivative contract I'd like to introduce is what's called a swap contract. When firms face recurring risk exposures, such as regularly having to convert US dollars into Canadian dollars or vice versa on a bi-weekly or even monthly basis, it can be really cost effective for them to simply buy multiple contracts for different delivery dates at the same time as a single package from a market maker. When you build up a collection of forward or futures contracts that are ultimately the same type of exposure, just simply broken across different dates, what you effectively have is a swap contract. Now, these kinds of contracts are quite commonly used to limit interest rate risk and foreign exchange risks between various companies. Ultimately, their goal here is to try to find inefficiencies in an international debt market, such that a company might be able to borrow cheaper in one currency than another, or borrow fixed rate debt at an advantageous rate compared to floating rate debt, and vice versa. British banks were the first to experiment with this kind of cross-lending contract in the 1970s, of having one party borrow in a particular structure and its counterparty borrow in the other, and then simply make loans to one another as a way of enabling them to borrow with each other's advantages. But the first formal swap contract was initiated in 1981 between IBM and the World Bank. As Investopedia puts it, the World Bank needed to borrow German marks and Swiss francs to finance its operations, but the governments of those countries prohibited it from borrowing activities. IBM, on the other hand, had already borrowed large sums of both those currencies, but needed US dollars when interest rates were relatively high for corporate borrowers. Salomon Brothers came up with the idea for the two parties to simply swap their debts. IBM swapped its borrowed francs and marks for the World Bank's dollars. IBM further managed its currency exposures with mark and franc. This swap markets have grown exponentially now to be roughly trillions of dollars in size, as described in one of the earlier segments. In addition to having simply swap contracts, one might imagine that these kinds of bilateral deals would eventually get formalized and centralized through some kind of central clearing party. In fact, the first stages towards that were the development of what we call a swap dealer. A swap dealer ultimately gets in the center of a swap transaction, much like a market maker does or a derivatives exchange does, looking to find many parties on both sides of a particular risk exposure and ultimately repackaging their risks to sell to the other side. Now, these market makers or swap dealers aren't necessarily trying to take on any kind of directional position in a trade. They don't want to have exposure to a particular currency or a particular kind of interest rate. All they're hoping to do is to get in the middle and intermediate a trade between two people who might otherwise not find each other. Now, dealers, of course, do use a few sort of standardized tools to try to limit the risks that they face of having so many interlocking debt contracts. And usually these include things like set-off rights that allow one party to stop making payments as if their counterparty stops, the use of net payments such that only the difference between two streams of cash are actually exchanged, thus limiting the amount of money that needs to be forced through the market system, and structuring payments into more frequent subperiods, sometimes every 3 months or every 6 months. Now, while the swap space was largely unregulated for some time, the 2008 financial crisis ultimately laid bare a lot of the risks that had developed in this space, particularly as was related to OTC traded swap contracts, as we'll see in the next set of videos.